where are you? What were you reading about the Constitution of the United States? I'm very curious. All right. Yes, the Articles of Confederation were, they were drafted by a committee headed by a man by the name of John Dickinson, who is actually the person most against the United States becoming independent. But he drafted the Articles of Confederation in 1777. They were ratified in 1781, and they were used for a grand total of 6 years before they realized they failed miserably. They weren't designed well for a nation that was supposed to kind of be united. It was designed for the states to sort of act like their own individual countries, and so because of that, the nation as a whole, wasn't able to raise money for armies. It was barely able to talk with make deals with other countries because they had no way of fulfilling their promises to other countries. So yeah, the Articles of Confederation were the United States' attempt before the Constitution, and it didn't work. And so when they realized it wasn't going to work in 1787, they decided to have a convention. Yes, well, it made in times of war was part of it. It was because that was part of it. Another big part of it was because it just wasn't kind of like what you said. It wasn't really designed to unify the states. It was designed to let each of the states act on their own, and it made it really weak as a whole. But yes, because it was wartime, there was that focus as well. The problem was, it was made in a wartime and didn't give the country as a whole a way to raise armies or fund military, and so that made it really, really weak. And that's a big old part of why it didn't last. Yeah, it was because the states didn't want the states each wanted their own state to live by their own state rules. They didn't want a power centralized that could tell each of the individual states what to do. They wanted to be able to kind of make their own laws and have them respected. And on one hand, that's still part of what the U.S. is supposed to do. It's supposed to let the states decide their own rules on a variety of subjects. But the Articles of Confederation took it a little too far, didn't give the central government anything to be able to do. So yeah, it was the states didn't want to give up any of their independence from each other. So that was a big old part of it. Which makes sense. The states did want their own independence. They still do in a lot of ways. Ah, crap, I don't want the tight deadline. And because of that, it's always been a balance of figuring out how much to give, like, the government around the states and how much to give the states themselves. It's been really, really tricky to figure that out. That's still been something that people haven't figured out for the last 200 years. No, it wasn't that. It was extreme measures. Oh, that's gonna bite me in the butt. Forced overtime and tight deadline 3. Okay. Madison was super helpful at the Constitutional Convention. The biggest thing Madison did at the Constitutional Convention, where they were drafting the Constitution, was he took notes like a teacher's pet. Like, he noted everything. We know so much about the convention because he wrote down everything that was said and everything that was did. And he helped draft the Constitution. The thing that Madison really was indispensable for was the Bill of Rights, which wasn't made with the Constitutional Convention. It came a few years later. So he gave a lot of those rights that most nations value: the freedom of the press, the right to gather, the fair trial, and things like that. Those were all things he wrote after the convention was over, because the convention couldn't decide whether they wanted those rights to be part of the Constitution. They thought, well, if we give those, it kind of means that anything we don't think to write down aren't guaranteed. So they was like, well, if we don't mention any rights, we can just sort of assume we have all of the rights. But then they realized by not writing down any of the rights, there was no guarantee that any of the rights would be given to the people. So Madison wrote up the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which was called the Bill of Rights. But yeah, his notes from the convention were so freaking helpful. Like, I've used them a lot in my research, and he was essentially the teacher's pet. He was like just needed to write down everything, and a lot of the people were cranky. They were in a hot building constantly for months, arguing with each other over stupid stuff, and so they were, by the time they were finished and they thought about doing something about the Bill of Rights, they were like, no, we've been at this too long. We really don't want to be dealing with this anymore. So they kind of quit. And so later Madison wrote up the Bill of Rights, and it was super, super wise thing to do. The Constitution itself was written, it really was written by committee in a lot of ways. Although, I will say, I'm so glad you brought Adams. Adams is my specific field of study. Adams is my passion. He's the thing I study the most. He is absolutely he's my guy. He's the one I love. Let's see, text. Yeah, we gotta do that. Okay. And he is actually, he contributed a lot more than people think to the Constitution. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. He wasn't at the meeting where they drafted the Constitution. He was serving as an ambassador at the time in England. But the Constitution was drafted off of his political philosophies and what he used to write a constitution for his personal state. He was arguably the philosophical and legal genius among the founders. He was brilliant. And so he was the one that drafted the structure of government that ended up being used in the Constitution. He'd already used it a decade earlier in the Constitution he made for his home state. And so when they were coming up with the national Constitution, what he had done was an inspiration to a lot of them for how it happened. Yes, yeah, he had to deal with France in the Quasi-War. He had to deal with the Barbary pirates. He had a lot he had to deal with, and I will be the first to say he was not a perfect human being. He was very insecure. He was very argumentative and not great at personal relations, and but he was still indispensable to the founding. He did his very best, and he had huge contributions that it tend to be overshadowed just because, I mean, the people he was working with were Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John and Ben Franklin, all these other huge names that it's kind of really difficult to stand out against. But he is still absolutely crucial to the United States. Yeah, and yeah, he had to deal with the French. He had to deal with he had to deal with a lot. All the early presidents did. It was very difficult because a lot of times they were still trying to figure it out as they were going along. Oh crap, time. I can talk about this subject all day. So his presidency wasn't necessarily the best. He which is one of the reasons he was, he only had one term as president compared to some of the others. He made some big mistakes. He made something called the Alien and Sedition Act, which was very concerning in a lot of ways. It tried to kind of decide what the press could and couldn't print about certain subjects. It had some bad treatment of immigration. Yes, he was. Yeah, there was not a soul alive that was going to go against George Washington's. I won't say a soul. He had plenty of detractors, but most people just loved George Washington, and he tended to make the right decisions. He tended to make some stuff that was really, really beneficial for the country as a whole. Washington was the GOAT. Washington was the one we respect. He had people that disagreed with him, which everybody should. Oh crap, I'm out of time. But so in it, John Adams had some big shoes to fill after Washington, and he didn't necessarily fill it. No one ever would, really. It's hard to say whether we'll ever have a president as good as Mr. George Washington. He was impressive. He had his flaws. He had more than his fair share of flaws, but he was still. If he hadn't made some of the decisions he had, there's very possible we'd have fallen apart by now. Yeah, I know, I'm dead. So yeah, Adams liked Washington. Everyone, for the most part, liked Washington, but he knew what to do. He knew to set up certain practices as a president, and it was a good move. It wasn't perfect. It was far from perfect. And yeah, I know, I'm dead. I can't. It's hard to talk while I'm doing this. But Washington decided to resign after 2 terms. He didn't have to do that. He did disseminations of power. He tried to keep party politics out of it. He was very careful in the decisions he made. And Adams tried, but he also he went up against Thomas Jefferson in his second election. And Jefferson he was very much everything Adams was not. He was charismatic. He was much more relatable and likable to people. And so Jefferson, they had sort of the first, like, really kind of bitter presidential campaign. They had, it got personal, it got argumentative. That didn't happen with Washington, or when he resigned, it didn't happen with Adams. In fact, presidential campaigning at the time, political campaigns were kind of frowned upon. It was sort of the practice to not campaign. You didn't even want to be seen like you were campaigning. But when Adams went up against Jefferson, that kind of went out the window. They went at each other hard. Some consequences. Jury summons 2. Yes, Adams and Jefferson died on the same day. And if I remember correctly, it was on the anniversary, like what the U.S.'s anniversary is generally considered to be. And they had become, their friendship really broke for a while during the political stuff, but they became friends again towards the end. But yeah, they died on the same day. It was they had become friends again by then. It was something else. Come on, what am I doing? Right. So that is something to, yeah, they were good people. Yes. Yes, it was. They had a respect for each other that they kind of lost sight of when they, I don't even remember a single thing I rolled. I'll just pick some at random. No, yeah, let's do that. And that. Okay. So yeah, he didn't, obviously, the time, they weren't updated instantly. So they didn't know that the Either was kind of in that position. Oh crap, I think I forgot to change my weapon. Alright, let's do that. Did I forget? No, I remembered. Okay, good. Okay, good. And they were very peas in a pod. They were very, very smart. They were both very philosophical. But they had different ideas about what the government should be early on, and that split them up for a really long time. They'd been very close for quite a while, and then when it came time to sort of decide, how the government should be run, they had very strong disagreements on what should be done, and it was sort of one of the reasons they had gotten along for so long was they were both very, excuse me, they were both very, very passionate about what the government should be. They were both, they both were very strong on the United States getting its own independence. They had a lot of similar takes on a lot of personal rights, not all of them. Jefferson had some very disagreeable taste in terms of slavery. So did Washington. So, but so that part wasn't great. Yes. Jefferson especially did not want to get rid of slavery. He had no intention of that happening. And a lot, not just Jefferson, I won't say just Jefferson, roughly half of the states did not want to get rid of slavery. And that was part of the reason they didn't want to see the central government, the federal government, get too much power over the states. Because at the time, the general rule, it didn't become official until later, was some states could have slavery be legal, and other states could decide not to have slavery be legal. And that was part of the reason that a lot of the states didn't want to see power given to the central government to maybe decide, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this and enforce it on all the states. So that was part of the reason. Part of the reason that people didn't want a central government too was they were worried that would make it really close to sort of a monarchy or an aristocracy, where they wouldn't be able to, the power would be too much in one central location. By putting a lot on the states, it allowed power to be, sort of spread out and sort of balanced, which was very, very useful. It's going to always be a delicate balance of a central power and power among the states, and so that's always going to be a thing. But yeah, slavery, there was. It was debated a lot in the founding of the United States. It's always been chaotic. If you listen to, if you talk to a lot of Americans, they sort of have this impression that there was this sort of noble, unified view of what the country should be, and No, it was a bunch of bickering, opinionated, strong-headed individuals all arguing with each other about what was supposed to happen. And the type of government that was being created, this sort of combination of a republic of different states and representatives and a democracy in general, was it was something that hadn't to that extent been done before. And that's one of the reasons, they tried with the Articles of Confederation, and that didn't work, and so they came up with the Constitution, which has worked better. It hasn't been perfect. It's, and again, things like slavery are issues that are a, definitely an embarrassment of the U.S. It's something that even now we have trouble addressing the history of. But it's a tough one. It's very, very tough, and it is very difficult to embrace. But yeah, they tried for they worked on different governments, and you can find letters between all of them about what they think should and shouldn't work, and all sorts of different things, and it is quite the process. And that was just the concept. That wasn't even seeing it in practice. It's like, okay, we can have this sort of balance of powers and figure out how to make it work the best. And that wasn't even, then it started actually happening. It's like, okay, what do we actually do here? What happens when we have to decide how to declare a war? What happens when a president dies? How much power does the vice president have? Like, all these different things that they hadn't really figured out from the start, and they had to kind of make up as they went along. It was very, very, very difficult. And so it still is that, it's the whole slavery thing is an entire history. It's its entire own, like, subject. There's so much involved in it. I mean, not that when I say its own subject, it's not that it's not something to be discussed. It's super worth discussing, but there's so much there to talk about. Yes, yeah. There's the modern United States, and I don't like talking about modern U.S. politics. I'll talk about the old stuff forever. I don't like talking about the new stuff too much. But yeah, there's a lot of, continues to be a lot of U.S. pride, and it was, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, the people that made it were English, and a lot of them wanted to remain English. Even when they were getting ready to revolt against England. Again, John Adams, he wrote some essays under a fake name for a long time before before independence, and the name was Nova Ingles, which meant New Englishmen, because they hadn't fully decided whether they wanted to stop being Englishmen or not. It was kind of depended on how England decided to do things, and so it was, they weren't sure about that. The concept of American pride. Well, technically he was. I mean, all of those guys were British citizens. They were all part of the British Empire. Americans didn't exist yet, technically. They were all still part of the British Empire. So they were all technically British. And, they kind of, as far as they were concerned, became Americans when they made their own country, but they grew up, they spent their lives as English citizens. They had English identities. They were all technically English for a very long time. And they just kind of took on they had their own sense of identity. Like, they didn't, the colonies had their own sense of both considered themselves English and didn't. Like they knew that they were part of the empire, and they knew. Uh, where's the last enemy? There you are. They were part of the empire, but they were also they knew that they had their own culture distinct from the culture back in Britain. So it was a combination of them, and there were stereotypes too. How colonists were viewed compared to the people that lived back in England and that kind of thing. Um, so that was, they had their own thing, but up until independence, they were all still very much Englishmen. Mm, So that was kind of something that they had to come to grips with about, how to create their own identity after that. But as far as they were concerned, growing up, they were English. Yes. If England hadn't, been bankrupt by very expensive wars, they wouldn't have taxed the colonies as extensively, and the colonies probably wouldn't have been as upset or felt the need to revolt anywhere near as much. Um, but England had been strapped for cash, and they had to get money wherever they could, and they had these colonies that were making lots of products and had lots of resources that the European continent was, fighting over. And so they decided, okay, we'll take more money from these colonies. And so that's what they tried to do. And the colonists were like, no, we deal with this ourselves. You guys make decisions for yourselves, and then you expect us to pay for it. And England kind of thought they had that right. And they well, they did, but that didn't mean the colonists were going to accept it. So that was kind of what it was. Yeah, this war that England and France had been fighting on and off for a century. Had occasionally would just bankrupt them, and it happened to France too. I mean, there's a reason France had its own revolution right around the same time. Uh, Theirs didn't go as well, but they had you know absolutely drained their own citizens of money as well, and that's kind of what wars do. But the British just kind of didn't handle it super well. Neither did the French. They absolutely drained their citizens. So that's what happens. And American history tends to paint England a lot more unfairly. Yeah, I'll say a lot more unfairly than is deserved. Uh, England was doing what they were allowed to do. They were trying to keep their empire going, and part of the reason for the war was to defend their territory here in the colonies. Not a huge part, but it was part of it. So they felt, okay, well, the colonies can pay for it then.